We're going to talk more about the situation in Sudan now with international politics professor Sharath Srinivasan. You're the author of the book When Peace Kills Politics, International Intervention and Understanding Unending Wars in the Sudan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Sudan's defense minister says he's rejected a U.S. truce proposal, like we heard there in that piece. He says the Sudanese army will continue its fight against the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary. Why is he rejecting that proposal from the U.S.?
Well, this is a battle to the end between two fighting forces in the country. And one has to remember that this war began 2 years ago between two parties that had actually committed a coup against a civilian transitional government that came into being in 2019. So they were bedfellows in a coup, and then they fell out with each other. And this is a counter-revolutionary struggle in which only one can prevail. They've already been in power together in the center of the state and fallen out. So the sense, I think, is that neither feels that they can actually find a middle ground with the other. And that's leading to a battle to the end. The army claims its right as, quote unquote, the legitimate state actor, but both in effect were coup plotters. So the army, I think, feels that it has the moral legitimacy and upper hand against the paramilitary RSF, especially because of the RSF's heinous crimes against civilians, and that in a sense the moral balance is shifting in favor of the army precisely because of that. And in that sense, it doesn't see that accommodating the RSF in some kind of ceasefire or some kind of truce is going to serve its political ends.
And as you mentioned, I mean, we've been hearing these horrific stories from people who have been forced to flee al-Fasher. They've described abuse, things like rape at the hands of the RSF. Do we know how much direct targeting of civilians there's actually been?
It's hard to quantify and evidence this because there's such a lack of access for humanitarians, for journalists, for anyone to really get a sense of what's happening on the ground. But the reports that are coming out, whether they come through social media or through those who have contacts closer to the ground, are evidencing something that everyone had predicted might be, the scenario that it would arise if the siege indeed ended with the RSF taking al-Fasher. And that's because we saw in the patterns of violence committed by RSF members in Zamzam, internally displaced persons camp earlier this year, in El Geneina in Western Darfur at the start of this conflict, we saw patterns of violence against civilians which were very grave and very concerning, genocidal in many reports, certainly patterns of ethnic cleansing. So we can only really fear the worst, with good reason. And indeed, in that sense, what is striking about this situation is we saw it coming for a long time. This siege of al-Fasher was going on for about 500 days before al-Fasher finally fell. And all the while, the concern was this level of violence would occur because of there's underlying ethnic dimensions to this conflict. On the national level, it's a war between the army and the RSF, the paramilitary group. But at these regional and local levels, it also maps onto long histories of conflict and violence that pit also ethnic groups against each other in a battle for land, in a battle for resources, and for political control in the region.
We were talking earlier about this rejection of this U.S. truce. Are there other nations around the world who might be able to help mediate in this crisis at all?
Well, at the moment, the US is involved in what's called a Quad, and that Quad comprises Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the US. And really, they are the key actors these days in the conflict in Darfur, partly because the Egyptians and the Saudis are more on the side of the Sudan armed forces than not, and the UAE certainly is been in close cahoots with the Rapid Support Forces. So unless we get those countries external to the conflict to be part of a resolution, the risk is, of course, that they continue to side and support one side or the other, and the war continues. So these are the key actors. It's hard to imagine that any other actor will be able to prevail without them. But that said, this current constitution of this Quad has failed to materially change the outcome and achieve a breakthrough. And they've been trying for some months now.
Sharath, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. That's international politics expert and author Sharath Srinivasan. Thanks so much.